Hello. In today's video, I'm going to talk about something super important in context of understanding different cultures. I'm of course referring to Hofstede's dimensions here. But why do I consider Hofstede's dimensions super important? Well, culture, as I have already spoken about before, is extremely complex. It's almost like a complex big puzzle made up of innumerable beliefs, ideas, practices, symbols, history, habits, and many more aspects that I have already discussed, so I won't repeat them here. The point is, because culture is extremely complex, it is very difficult to make sense of it. Making sense of our own culture itself is so difficult. Now, imagine how you would make sense of some other culture. Hofstede simplified this by identifying certain dimensions. You have already probably heard of some of these dimensions. Power distance is one of them. Individualism versus collectivism is another one. And there are others. We will discuss them later. So based on how countries or different places or even different organizations vary on these dimensions, we could get some great insights about our own culture and about the culture of other places, other organizations. So this, I would say, is the biggest contribution of Hofstede to the study of culture. There are many other researchers and thought leaders who followed after him, and they have added more dimensions. But the foundation to all these later studies, I would say, comes from Hofstede's dimensions. That's why I would consider Hofstede's dimensions to be so important. But before we delve into these dimensions, let's understand a little bit more background about Hofstede, how he went about conducting his research, how did he come about with these dimensions. So Hofstede is this Dutch guy who worked for IBM, the big global company IBM. He worked there in the 70s, 80s, and probably into the 90s. Now, today, IBM is not as big a name. We have companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook that have overtaken IBM, and these companies have taken the center stage now. But in the 70s, 80s, 90s, IBM was the biggest multinational tech company. It had branches all over the world, and Hofstede worked there. Hofstede made use of this great network that the company provided, traveled all across the world, met with people from different countries, the employees working in these different countries. He interviewed them, he talked to, I think, over 115,000 people. You can imagine how big a sample size this is, especially researchers would appreciate the big sample size here. So he asked them lots of questions about their values, about how they see the world. And what did he find? He realized that cultures may seem different, even dramatically different from outside, but most of these differences fall on some major dimensions. This you could consider similar to what the psychologists have done with respect to the personality traits. Those who have taken my classes or watched my videos know that people, again, dramatically differ from each other on their personality traits. But most of these differences can be placed on just 5 dimensions, which we call as the big 5 personality traits. So the same thing is being attempted here by Hofstede. You can understand different cultures if you place them on the 5 dimensions that Hofstede identified. So this then becomes like a map that helps you understand your own culture and other cultures. Now we will delve deeper into the first dimension, which is the power distance dimension. So delving deeper into the concept of power distance, Hofstede defined it as the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. Power is often distributed unequally, right? Not everyone has the same power. But how accepting are the people low on the hierarchy of people high up the hierarchy having a greater amount of power? So what Hofstede is saying is that cultures vary in their acceptance of these differences. Some cultures, which he calls the high power distance cultures, there is greater acceptance of these differences in power, these differences in hierarchies, differences in authority, in political power or economic power or social status, whatever you call. Whereas then there are those countries where people don't accept or they are not accepting of big differences in these same things, that of economic power or political power or decision making power, right? So that's the main difference between the high power distance cultures and the low power distance cultures. Now, I think I should also quickly discuss the term power here, because power is a very important construct in my field of organizational behavior and leadership. Those of you who have attended my lectures know that it's a very important construct, and the way we define it is that it is the capacity to influence others. So while leadership is defined as the process of influencing others, power is defined as the capacity. And because it is defined as the capacity, without you having any capacity to influence others, you cannot influence others. In other words, without having power, you cannot influence. You cannot be a leader. You cannot engage in leadership. But of course, here, when we are talking about power, we are not talking about power only coming from a position of authority. In my field, we talk about power also coming from within you. Let's say you are extremely knowledgeable about something, then people would be more willing to follow you because you know your stuff. Let's say you have a highly magnetic personality, then people will fall in love with you and they will be more willing to follow you, right? So, in my field, when we are talking about power, we are not talking only about power coming from position of authority, although that capacity to influence others can also come from position of authority. Now, in Hofstede's work, it is that capacity coming from more authority positions is what is being talked about here. So people high up the hierarchy have power to make decisions. They may have more money, they may have more social status than those who are lower down the hierarchy. So, how okay are you with there being big differences between the haves and the have nots? That's what essentially the power distance dimension is about. Now, the power distance construct, this particular term, was actually not coined by Hofstede. He actually borrowed the term from Mark Mulder and his colleagues, who had been doing lots of research in the 60s and 70s on power distance. But they were social psychologists, and they meant something very different when they used the term power distance. But Hofstede took inspiration from their work and incorporated the term power distance in his own research. Now, let's quickly go through this 1973 study by Mulder and his associates, because I think it gives some great insights about power distance also in context of culture. So what they did in this study is that they recruited high school students to participate in an experiment that was supposedly about problem solving. So, as is usually done, they divide the participants randomly into different groups, I think 4 different groups. In each group, participants were assigned specific roles, that of an evaluator, and then there were people who worked as clerks. So somebody is being the evaluator, this is a person with more authority, and then people doing clerical work. So the researchers manipulated the power dynamics in these different groups by varying the amount of power that those in the roles of clerk and those in the role of senior evaluator had. Some groups, there was little difference in power between the clerks and the senior evaluator. Some other groups, there was bigger difference. They varied something else as well. They varied the self-confidence and ability of the senior evaluator. Now, you would wonder, how did they do that? Well, the senior evaluator in these experiments, it was not a real participant. It was an actor playing the role of an participant. So usually, always the actor was assigned the role of the senior evaluator. Now, the participants did not know that this person was an actor. They thought this senior evaluator is one of those participants. So, because it was an actor, the actor could show greater confidence or could demonstrate greater ability in the evaluation process in certain groups, and in certain other groups he could demonstrate not having enough ability, not having enough confidence. In any case, with these varying, the students had to perform a series of tasks, and after those tasks, the students were given the opportunity to take over the senior evaluator's position. So those in clerical position can now take the senior evaluator's position. So they found something really interesting. The results showed that students were more willing to assume the senior position when the senior evaluator, who was actually an actor, appeared to lack self-confidence. However, the closeness in power between the students and the senior evaluator did not have any significant effect on students' willingness to take over the senior position. So the closeness, that is related to power distance. And in the power distance, when power distance construct as described by Hofstede, when Hofstede is talking about how accepting and expecting you are of the differences in power. This is again really very insightful, because in this study, what did they find? They found that students are more likely to be accepting of the differences when the senior person, in this case the actor, demonstrated having lot of abilities, demonstrated having lot of confidence in what he or she was doing. Then that person having more power seems all right. People are accepting of these power differences. But if the person on the top does not have much ability, if the person on the top does not seem to know what he or she is doing, then people in the bottom will not be accepting of the differences in power. So that's broadly about power distance. But let me give some examples to illustrate, especially the concept of power distance as proposed by Hofstede. So picture yourself in a classroom. In this classroom, the students may be revering and respecting the teacher. They essentially defer everything to the professor. They may be rarely questioning his decisions. They discuss, but when they discuss, they say there's an element of respect for the professor. They do not necessarily engage in informal, open kind of conversations. In this classroom, the teacher, the professor, is the sole source of knowledge and authority. So students will be hesitant to challenge or question the teacher. They will follow the rules or the norms set by the teacher. So that would become an example of a classroom of high distance culture, where there's a big difference between the power that the teacher has and the students have very little power here. Now you can contrast that with a different classroom. Now you can imagine a classroom where there's a very egalitarian kind of environment, where the teacher and the students engage in informal interactions, friendly interactions. The students here may be feeling comfortable to express their opinions. They freely ask questions. They freely engage in discussions with the teacher. They may even critique some of the thoughts, ideas of the teacher. So this environment will be very collaborative, and the teacher's role would be more like that of a facilitator as opposed to an authoritative sage. So this culture would be an example of low power distance culture. And you can take this to the workplace context as well. In an organization with high power distance culture, and you see such organizations, not just in the traditionally high power distance countries, but also within the United States, within any country, where there's a clear hierarchy, where there's a distinction between those in power and those without power, and there's a huge respect for that authority. Decisions are taken top down. So in those organizations, you will see there's leaders hold considerable influence over the employees. The employees are only supposed to follow the directives of the leader without questioning them. or at least without questioning them too much. So you will see in such organizations, the communication channels are more formal, top down and formal. So that kind of organization would be a high power distance organization. And you can contrast that with a low power distance culture organization, where there's flatter organizational structure, there are no hierarchies, people can feel empowered to express their thoughts, opinions, contribute their ideas, challenge the thoughts of the boss. Communication will be informal. Even boss and the employees can have friendly relations. So that would be an example of low power distance culture. Anyway, I think I have spoken enough about power distance, but hopefully this gives you some insights about the fact that power distance is not just a theoretical concept here. It does manifest in the way people interact with each other. It does manifest in our daily lives, in fact. How we interact, especially with people who are above us, or if we are above, then how we interact with people below us. How we navigate the hierarchical structures that are part of all organizations, all societies. Because there is no absolutely low power distance culture where there exists no hierarchies. There is no such thing like that. So we will delve deeper now into power distance with some more examples. Let's break down these two figures to understand the concept of power distance more. In the first figure that you see here, you see what is a depiction of low power distance culture. By the way, self-disclosure, this is not something that I created. I just pulled up these figures from Google search. In any case, in this figure, you see people standing next to each other in a circle. So, what does this visual representation embody? What does it show? It shows that's an egalitarian worldview here. People are equal to each other. They are on equal footing with each other. It could show that there's a shared decision-making process here. The circular arrangement could even show, let's say, free flow of communication. No hierarchical barriers as may be seen in the next figure. So people can feel empowered to talk to each other, no restrictions, no barriers. Irrespective of what status you have, what position you are in the group, you can freely talk to each other. But in the next figure, what we see the person at the top is the single individual. He is the person with the maximum authority. As we move down the hierarchy, as we move down this pyramid kind of structure, we see people lower in the hierarchy have lesser power than those above in the hierarchy, right? So, this hierarchical arrangement conveys a sense of vertical relationship. So here I would say the relationship is more horizontal. Here the relationship is more vertical. So power distance, when we are saying, that's a vertical distance that we are referring to here. Those lower down the hierarchy are expected to follow the directions of their superiors. So that's the unequal distribution of power that we are talking about in high power distance cultures. And people in these lower levels, they are accepting of people above them having more power. So that's high power distance versus low power distance means. Now, these are some differences that Hofstede talks about, are the differences between high power distance and low power distance cultures. I've already gone through most of these points, but let me highlight few quickly here. Inequality is considered normal in high power distance cultures. Because it is considered normal, that's the reason people are accepting of these big differences in power. Whereas in low power distance culture, inequality could be considered wrong, maybe even immoral, right? And not just power distance, all the dimensions of culture, they tend to get transmitted from one generation to the other through interactions that the older generation has with the younger generation through parenting techniques. So we do see this getting manifested in the way children are taught in these different cultures. In high power distance cultures, they are taught to respect these seniors, the elders. That's the key virtue. But in low power distance cultures, children are taught more to become independent. You don't necessarily have to respect the elders. In high power distance cultures, those on the top are considered better human beings, superior human beings in terms of intelligence, in terms of ability, for instance. But in low power distance cultures, any hierarchy, they are just done for practical reasons. Centralized versus decentralized. Again, we have already discussed this through those diagrams that I showed you before. Centralized means most of the important big decisions are taken at the top. Whereas decentralized, everyone can participate in the decision-making process. Excuse me. So, in high power distance cultures, those in the bottom, subordinates, are expected to be told, do this, do that. But in low power distance cultures, the subordinates are expected to be consulted. So you know the different theories of leadership. Different theories of leadership like the normative decision-making model, where there are different levels of consultation. Should you as a leader take the decision on your own, or should you consult your followers? So when it comes to power distance, in the low power distance cultures, it may be wiser to go the consultative route. Whereas in high power distance cultures, it may be fine for the leader to take the decision on one's own. So these are some of the major differences. Now let's go through some of the ethical considerations in context of power distance. And we will do this by comparing these two figures that you see here. In the first figure, you see the feudal system of medieval Europe. That would be an example of high power distance culture. Why? Of course, because you see a hierarchy here. At the top is the king, the monarch, and then below the king are the noblemen, the nobles. And there could be several hierarchies within the nobles too. There could be lords, I think, the barons, the dukes, and so on and so forth. But the king and his family, they have the absolute power and authority over the territory. The nobles, they are granted some land and these titles by the king in exchange for their loyalty and military service. Then below the nobles are the knights. They are the warriors who serve the lords. They serve the lords. And finally at the bottom you have the peasants, the serfs, who do the farming, they toil the land, which is owned by people above them. They rarely own anything. So they earn a meager living. But they do work hard in exchange for the protection that they may be getting from the knights and the nobles. And they have to pay tax to those above them. Otherwise, they will be punished. So that's the traditional hierarchical system that you would see in the feudalistic society of Europe. More than anything, power and status in the system are very rigid, right? They can usually only be inherited. You cannot easily move from a lower class to the upper class, because social mobility is determined in this society based on birth, or largely based on birth. If you are born a peasant, you die a peasant. If you are born to the king's family, you may not necessarily become a king always, because there can only be one king, but you are still part of the king's family, or at least you become a noblesman. So this in fact reminds me of a recent movie that I watched. It was a movie from Denmark, I think, a Danish movie. It had the actor Mads Mikkelsen, and the movie was The Promised Land. So in that movie, Mads Mikkelsen, he is playing the role of a captain, a decorated war hero. And this movie, I think, is situated sometime in the 1700s. But he would be an illegitimate son of a nobleman, of a noble. So, because he being illegitimate, of course, he cannot be part of the nobles. So, even the rank of captain is something that he gained with lot of difficulty, working up the hierarchy over a period of maybe 15-20 years. So he has this ambition, because of his historical background, to become a nobleman. And his strategy is to build a settlement on a vast barren land in Denmark, where lots of people had failed to create any settlement in the past. It was extremely barren land where farming seemed impossible. So he thinks if he succeeds in this endeavor, then the king will notice him, and he will then be granted one of the titles associated with the nobles. Then the movie shows how he faces lots of opposition, and the opposition is coming from where? Not from the bottom, but from the top, from the noblesmen. And the main villain is also one of the noblesmen who don't want this character played by Mads to get the status of a nobleman. So that's classic high power distance. Now you can contrast such rigid hierarchy with an open office kind of environment that you see here. You would see this in many offices these days in the United States, but more so in the tech companies in the Silicon Valley, for instance. Those are examples of low power distance culture. Very flat organizational structure, meaning there will not be many hierarchical levels within the organization. There will still be a CEO, CFO and those people, but there won't be 10 different hierarchical levels. There may be just 2 or 3. So relatively flatter organizations. You will see the office setting also something like this, where managers and the employees, They all have office in the same space. They sit in close proximity to each other. They can easily access each other. They have direct access. So in this environment, you will see greater collaboration, more egalitarian kind of environment. Decisions will be more of an open dialogue in nature as opposed to top-down. People can voice their opinions, challenge the ideas of the superiors, and so on and so forth. But more than anything, you may start your job here in the mailroom, but if you have the ability, you can rise up the hierarchy and even become the CEO of the company. Whereas that won't be possible in the feudalistic society that we talked about before. Now, this does not mean that high power distance is bad. In this slide, in this, I would say, even provocative picture, you see birds sitting on some sort of ladder, forming almost like a pyramidal structure. At the top of the pyramid, we see this bird who is defecating on the birds below, and they in turn defecating on the birds below them. So each successive bird receives shit from the birds above. This would be what a high power distance culture is supposed to be. But I would say it's a very negative depiction of the high power distance culture. Extremely negative, I would say, because it gives the impression that high power distance cultures are dysfunctional, inherently oppressive, which may not be the case. In this picture, which probably was created by some communist, I don't know, I just pulled it up from the internet, you see this being supposedly a depiction of the capitalist system. How capitalism is so bad, according to this picture, because it is extremely hierarchical. There are people on the top and they are oppressing people on the bottom, and that's how people on the top create lot of wealth, and those on the bottom of the pyramid, they are the ones who are getting oppressed. They don't have much access to resources. Socialism and communism in theory, of course, aim to reduce or eliminate social and economic and political inequalities by advocating for collective ownership of resources. In practice, you usually will see that such organizations become, such countries become even more hierarchical. And if they were becoming just hierarchical, that would still be fine. They become tyrannical. So if you know the statistics, countries that had communism, they have killed over 100 million people over the last 150 years or so since communism came into existence. That is way higher than even Hitler. Hitler killed some 6 million Jews and few other million people. Contrast that with more than 100 million, and this is a conservative estimate of the people killed by the communists. So just seeking equality, that everything be equal, is not necessarily a sign that it will lead to equality, is essentially what I'm trying to say. In fact, the high power distance cultures be really great in certain situations. You see the different army ranks. There are several ranks from the lowest level rank here, that of a private, to the topmost general. There are so many levels, right? Now, of course, if you have the ability and capacity, you theoretically should be able to move up these hierarchies and even become the topmost person in the army. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is that most armed forces, they tend to be high power distance cultures. People in the lower ranks, they are not necessarily being oppressed by people in the higher ranks. The military organizations, they can be extremely functional. They are extremely important, necessary for the country's security. They tend to be extremely functional. There may be strong social cohesion at all the different levels. They tend to be extremely efficient. So this is in fact one of the advantages of high power distance culture. Because there's a hierarchy, well-defined hierarchy, because there's a clear line of authority, the decision-making process can be extremely efficient, which becomes important, which becomes critical during some operations. We talked about respect for authority before versus the importance given to being independent, right? That deep respect for authority is again something that gets emphasized in the military, saluting your officers and so on and so forth. But that's again not necessarily bad. It can contribute to that stability of the organization. It contributes to harmony in the organization. It contributes to order, discipline, adherence to the norms of the organization, the values of the organization. In fact, in many of the high power distance cultures, you will see, or I would argue, greater amounts of happiness than in low power distance cultures. Why? Because in some sense, knowing your place in the society can make things very stable, predictable. You don't feel like a failure. If a peasant knows he cannot become a knight or a noble's man, he figures out ways of being happy while being at that level. A knight figures out ways of being happy while being at that level. If it is generally considered that you can easily climb up the hierarchy, you can even become the top of the person. Of course, there's less space on the top, so only few people can go and reach the top. That means many people will not be able to go to the top. Many people will not be able to achieve that level of success, that level of financial wealth that you want, which then means that there will be greater unhappiness. You feel like a failure. Many of these high power distance cultures, you could see, they preserve the tradition, as tradition is respected and preserved within the armed forces, for instance. So it is not like an open door where people come and go, where there is no strong culture, nothing that is valued as much, that you need to preserve and uphold those cultural values, those traditions. So there can be a stronger identity with the culture, with the local culture in the high power distance culture. These are some, thoughts that come to mind. I'm sure there are more, but one thing that I do want to emphasize is that we can have preferences for low power distance or for high power distance, but we should not automatically view the culture in the other direction to be negative. Sorry for that interruption. Now, Hofstede came up with indices for all the 5 dimensions that he discusses. For power distance, he came up with this index called Power Distance Index, PDI for short. So countries have scores on this power distance index. If the scores are closer to 0, or the smaller they are, the lower the power distance. The higher the score, the closer it is to 100, it's a high power distance culture. But do remember that all societies, all cultures, even in nature, there is inequality. All societies are unequal. It's just that some societies are more unequal than others. That's the key message to keep in mind. These are the scores of countries on the power distance index. Not all the countries, of course, but I just took some of the top countries and the bottom countries on the power distance index. So the ones that are highlighted here, that's the column that I want you to look at, and those are countries with high power distance. And here we have countries who have the lowest power distance. So highest power distance is Malaysia, lowest is Austria. If you look at these countries that are high in power distance, you will see Malaysia, Guatemala, Panama, Mexico, Venezuela, Iraq, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, many countries that are not necessarily rich. You do see some rich countries here, like you do see China, you do see Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, but not many. In contrast, when you look at the list of countries in low power distance, you see a lot of rich countries: Austria, Israel, Denmark, New Zealand, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Switzerland, United Kingdom, Germany, and so on and so forth. You do see few poorer countries like Jamaica, even South Africa, Argentina, but generally you see more rich countries that are low on power distance. But the important thing to remember is that the differences in income inequality that you see between the high power distance and low power distance cultures is not because of power distance being the cause of inequality, but rather these are just correlations, is what Hofstede argues. And that should make sense, because income inequality or wealth, these are things that are often influenced by other factors more than by power distance. I won't say that power distance does not influence these outcomes at all, but they are much less potent than other factors. Like, for instance, the history of a country. When was it colonized? When did it get freedom? What were the political philosophies of the people who took over the reins of the new country? When did industrialization happen? Did they follow a capitalist form of economy, or did they follow a communist or socialist form of economy? Whole host of factors would contribute to the wealth of a nation. So we should not attribute any of the Hofstede's dimensions as being cause of these differences in wealth then. So these are more like correlations than anything else. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. If it's a capitalist country, then naturally you are more likely to see greater amount of wealth. If it's a communist country, that theoretically is based on the principle of equality, but it also in practice leads to elimination of all class distinctions. So there may not be any motivation for you to then work hard to achieve some amount of wealth that you want to get in your life. So anyway, I don't necessarily want to go in that direction right now, but my point is a whole host of other factors, including political factors, can contribute to the wealth. In the previous slide, you saw, for instance, Venezuela being a communist socialist country that is high on the power distance dimension, and it's poor. But we also have rich countries that are socialist, like many of the Scandinavian countries. They are low power distance countries, socialist countries, and yet very rich. So point is, there are many factors that contribute to these patterns that we see between countries. But we do see some of these patterns between these countries, and these are few things to be noted. In any case, I think I will stop my presentation here, and we will go through the remaining dimensions of Hofstede in the next video.